Oh, Konami, how things have changed over the years. There was a time when Konami was a name that got you excited, a magical little time that I like to call the 90s. And while in later years the name Konami was more prone to cause other kinds of reactions, for this video we're going to be focusing on what was good. And sure, Konami put out some great games before and after the 90s, but I want to focus on the 90s for this video because some of my favorite games of all time came from this period. Japanese game developers were pretty dominant during the 90s, and Konami was one of the biggest players. They really spread the wealth around too, with tons of good games across most of the major systems. And let's not forget the arcade either, with some of the biggest arcade games of the time coming from Konami, including a bunch of games based on licensed properties that people have a whole boatload of nostalgia for. They tackled all sorts of different genres too: action platformers, run and guns, beat 'em ups, shoot 'em ups, RPGs, survival horror, and how could we forget the king of all video games that came right at the end of the 90s? That's right, DDR. Move your body. Okay, that typically gets thought of as its own thing, but my point remains. Konami made a variety of games. Heading into the 90s from the late 80s, they saw their profits increase exponentially, in large part because they made a ton of money off their games for the NES. So the progression to then develop games for the Super Nintendo was logical, making some of the most iconic games for the system, including Contra 3, Castlevania 4, and the famous arcade port of Turtles in Time. They also published some games that they didn't develop themselves, like Zombies Ate My Neighbors. Most people would just look at the Konami label and think Konami made it, but nope, LucasArts made this game. Anyways, Konami would bring their flagship series Contra and Castlevania to the Sega Genesis as well, with brand new original games. Imagine that. I feel like on more modern consoles what would have happened is they just poured over the already existing games, but nope, instead they made brand new games that took advantage of the differences between the two consoles, and made games that fell more in line with the Sega Genesis branding and attitude. As a result, the games feel very much like Sega versions of Contra and Castlevania, giving us 4 distinct Contra and Castlevania games during the 16-bit era. Oh wait, they made an original Castlevania game for the PC Engine as well? Make it 5. Oh wait, they made another Castlevania game for the Super Nintendo that, despite being marketed as a port, was really its own unique game? Make it 6. You know, it's no secret that game development used to not take as long as it does now. The benefit is that Konami was able to release so many unique titles for 2 of their flagship series during the 16-bit generation, all while still cranking out tons of other great games at the same time. When people think of the good old days of Konami, it's not just that they used to make good games, it's that they were cranking them out left and right. And for every awesome game that got a lot of attention, like Turtles 4, there were a handful of lesser-known awesome games like Sunset Riders, Biker Mice from Mars, and Rocket Knight Adventures. Also, I should probably at least briefly mention the developer Treasure because they were formed by ex-Konami employees who wanted a little bit more freedom to make the games they wanted, like a McDonald's game. All kidding aside, even that McDonald's game is pretty solid, and their games all felt like Konami games in spirit, but just with a little bit more of a unique twist to them in most cases. So yeah, I tend to kind of lump them in together with Konami, at least as far as game recommendations go. Let's talk more about the licensed properties that Konami would tackle. Capcom tended to handle the Disney properties during this time, but that didn't stop Konami from making games for some other really big properties like X-Men, The Simpsons, and perhaps most famously the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I think these types of games really contributed to gamers remembering Konami fondly during that time period, because making a great game is one thing, but if you make a game that is great and it's based on an intellectual property that people already love, then you're really onto something special. That is how dreams came true for kids, because here's the scenario. You're at home, obsessed with watching the show, playing with the action figures, reading the comic books, or what have you. Kids couldn't get enough of this stuff, and then worlds collide when one day you go to the arcade, a game store, or your friend's house and discover that there's an awesome video game they made for it. Win-win. Unfortunately for us retro gamers nowadays, this means there's often a lot of legal mumbo jumbo involved in getting these games re-released, and that certainly sucks since it makes these games a little less accessible to be able to play. Okay, so moving on from the 16-bit generation to the 5th generation, how did Konami do? Well, the games were great. Well, some games were more well received than others, but for the most part they kept up with the tradition of cranking out awesome games. My two personal favorites are probably Metal Gear Solid 1 and Symphony of the Night, hence why I own them. Metal Gear Solid is one of the few examples of a series that was converted from being 2D to 3D with booming success. Sure, that has more to do with the excellent story and writing of Hideo Kojima, and sure, the true prior games in the series weren't even released in the US, but regardless, it's a great game. At the time this game came out, voice acting in video games was in its infancy, and as a result, pretty bad in most cases. This made the voice acting in this game, of which there was a ton, all the more impressive since it was actually some pretty good voice acting. Even to this day, I still think it holds up. The stealth gameplay was also a fairly new concept at the time, and when you combine everything together, you're left with what I consider to be one of the best games ever made, as do many others. When it comes to Konami franchises that didn't make the transition from 2D to 3D quite as well as the Metal Gear series did, you have Castlevania. Now, sure, not everybody hates these games, but it certainly wasn't a runaway success. Lucky for us, Konami treated us to another 2D Castlevania game, even though 3D was all the rage at the time, Symphony of the Night. In a lot of ways, it plays almost nothing like the 2D Castlevania games that came before it, helping create a genre commonly referred to as Metroidvania due to its more exploration-based gameplay as opposed to the more linear, classic structure of the older Castlevania games. While I personally give a slight edge to the more classic Castlevania games, this is a lot of people's favorite Castlevania game, favorite PS1 game, and even just favorite game period. I give Konami a lot of credit for releasing a game like this at the time they did. Other popular titles include the likes of Silent Hill, their breakout survival horror hit that often gets compared to Capcom's Resident Evil, but really is a very different game and deserves credit for being unique in that respect. There's also Suikoden, am I saying that right? Konami's best RPG series according to many, that may not have been mega popular back then, but is certainly well regarded by retro gamers nowadays. And then of course during this generation in the arcades they had DDR. That was a big deal for them and would continue to be for a long time. And that about does it for Konami during the 90s. Like I said before, they certainly made some good games after the 90s, but the farther away from the 90s you go, the closer you get to what they would become, and that's just kind of sad to think about. So I try to remember them for what they were when they would pump out awesomeness. Of course, there are a ton more great games that there's no way I could mention all of in this video, and what could be a better opportunity for you, the viewer, to list some of your favorite Konami games. Oh, and just for the fun of it, let me throw this question in. If you had to choose one game between the X-Men, Simpsons, and Ninja Turtles arcade games, which one would you pick? I'd definitely go with Ninja Turtles myself. Okay, so be sure to leave those comments down below with your favorite Konami games or any other thoughts you may have. Heck, if you're just looking for another opportunity to crap on what Konami turned into, then you can do that as well. So leave those comments down below and I will see ya in the next video.